Hollywood. Once upon a time, they ran the whole thing, and they were good at it. In the 1960s, Hollywood was enjoying the fruits of its labour. After decades of signing and training actors, giving the best directors scripts from the best writers in the business, a catalogue of work was produced that no system had matched in cinema. Hollywood became more than a film industry. It was an empire built on people's dreams, where ideas and stars were crafted into icons of their times. And this great reputation was owed to their quality, whether it was the soaring optimism of Singing in the Rain or the epic religiosity of Ben-Hur. The iron grip of the studio system meant that every story was polished to perfection. It was the golden age, and the Big Five had complete dominion over an industry they ensured ran like a well-oiled machine and seemed to produce nothing but hits. If you were an artist and you made it in Hollywood, you were capable of anything. Cecil B. DeMille creates the Ten Commandments. MGM put all their eggs in one basket to make Gone with the Wind. Marlene Dietrich, Humphrey Bogart, Marilyn Monroe, Shirley Temple, Gene Crawford, Howard Hawks, Alfred Hitchcock, Bing Crosby, John Ford, and the Marx Brothers were just a few of the household names that owed their popularity to the ingenuity of the Hollywood studio system. The town was, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. The golden age of Hollywood is often derided for its clean and romanticised depictions of life. The idea that this isn't real life, it's just how it is in the movies. And although there is truth in this statement, this notion also diminishes the incredible output of this era, as well as downplays how amazing it was that at its most industrialised, the big studios were still ready to push the great artists of the time. It was not the ideology of Hollywood that destroyed it, but perhaps hubris. Perhaps it was forgetting that while standing seemingly on its towering podium, that Hollywood had been here before. The emergence of the sound era meant that the almost unshakable stranglehold Hollywood had on its artists was completely re-altered. Things beyond their control led to the rigid assurance of the industry having to adapt. The fates of the stars of the silent era and the new era of sound had to be decided. The aftermath of World War II brought a malaise and uncertainty in the public, which meant that Hollywood once more had to adapt with an emergence of artists whose perspective had been irreconcilably altered by the atrocities we had all been exposed to. Film noir is embraced by the industry. Throughout history, Hollywood had managed to navigate the mood and desires of its audience, and yet decades later, there appeared to be a stagnation after years of such astronomical success. Something happened, or rather, didn't happen, where Hollywood seemed to just stay the same for a long time, and before they knew it, they'd crossed a barrier and became disconnected from the audience that had once made them so successful. A change in tastes, an ever-expanding counterculture, as well as the advent of television, had perhaps been the biggest reshuffling Hollywood had undergone, to the point where these grand social revolutions reframed the studio system and the whole industry itself to have become utterly irrelevant. Once, Hollywoodland stood proudly on the Santa Monica Mountains, but pride led to an inability to adapt, and what was once deemed impossible became a reality. Over time, dilapidated and neglected, the sign became a perfect comparison for the collapse of a once mighty empire. The dream was over. It was once thought impossible for Hollywood to reach these depths, to lose its status, though it was perceived as perhaps an even greater impossibility to resurrect this once great beast. It would take a miracle, but what followed in the American cinema of the 1970s was arguably the greatest decade of cinematic output in the history of film. Welcome to New Hollywood, the industry's great rebellion. When the era of New Hollywood begins isn't a specific moment. We can't point to one film as the instigator for the movement. Rather, we must look at the subtle changes that occurred over time in order for this movement to become fully realised. Although the American New Wave is most associated with the 1970s, we can go as far back as the early 1960s to see its roots taking place. In A Child is Waiting, Burt Lancaster and Judy Garland start alongside one another in a story about teaching music in a school for mentally disabled children.
I want you to draw something, Reuben. Reuben, I told you I want you to draw something.
The film had ties to the studio system in that Burt Lancaster and Judy Garland were as big stars as you could get. Once. Their fame hadn't faded. However, Judy Garland had only featured in a few films in the years prior to this, and Burt Lancaster continued to be in films at this point. However, his largest success of this year was in fact The Leopard by Luchino Visconti. So this wasn't a major release for the time, and the popularity amongst audiences shows, with A Child is Waiting making a loss of around $2 million, a staggering amount for the time. So then what makes this film relevant to the development of New Hollywood? Well, A Child is Waiting arrived quietly, bathed in black and white. This wouldn't mean much if Judy Garland weren't one of the actresses synonymous with Technicolor. The film carries a drama that felt grounded, and we see a vulnerability in these stars that we hadn't quite seen before.
Down to the ground, ground, ground. See the snow fly, 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 with never a sound.
Alongside the transgressions of its female lead, the film broke away from the pristine and joyous aesthetic once associated with Hollywood productions. Cassavetes pushed for naturalistic performances, was open to improvisation. The film had more in common with a documentary than any of the studio films that preceded it. The film was clearly carrying something authentic that most productions lacked. The intense proximity of the camera, the often unscripted feel of the scenes.
At least what you know about Thanksgiving. It's the story of the first settlers when they came to this country.
And what did people think of the film? Well, all we need to do is to read the reviews of the time. It was described as a revealing dramatization, that there was an alchemy that's taught in the theatres that may be too distressing for the cinema. The people were not ready. The system was not ready. And as a result, producer Stanley Kramer, a face for the once brilliant old guard, stripped Cassavetes' original vision and re-edited the film. Only with hindsight do we recognise Cassavetes' genius for the development of American cinema. A Child is Waiting may not be remembered as a new Hollywood film, but it was a warning shot, a glimpse into what would come to fruition just a few years later. In fact, Cassavetes, by the time Faces was released, he'd established Faces International, a distribution company to handle all his films. A sign of the shift of power from executives to the creatives. Fast forward a couple of years, and by 1966, the cracks in Hollywood's golden facade were deepening, but the studios hadn't gone completely. They were still determined to re-emerge, but perhaps it was time that they accepted their fate. It was they that needed to change. And so, you go to the cinema and watch Universal's new film, Seconds. The film opens in a train station, in what can only be described as a dream, or more so, an uncanny nightmare. We follow a faceless man walking amongst faceless people in a way we've never seen before in cinema. What was this we were seeing? Cameras aren't supposed to work like this. The story of a man who receives a second chance at life unfolds as we see what truly happens when one's internal fantasies are achieved, and the result is a haunting glimpse of paranoia in the framework of a science fiction film.
That's no answer! I want to know what's happening to me now! Don't shout, please! No!
Seconds oozes with its disassociations. Its ephemeral cinematography traps us in a nightmare as all the visual conventions of the Hollywood system were cast into a mixture of both the beautiful with the grotesque. Mainstream cinema aesthetics were attempting to blur the sacred with the profane. But what was really going on here? What were these films? This was Judy Garland and Rock Hudson, the symbols of American supremacy in a media-saturated world. But now they were raw and ugly and fragile. All of a sudden, there was something real about them. The social milieu that served as background seemed an adequate enough reason for works of this ilk to emerge, but it was far more than that. The filmmakers that were emerging during this period and their influences had stemmed back to the previous decades of European dominance in the high art circles of the cinematic world. As such, many of the techniques that pioneered this era of European cinema, the avant-garde editing, films unafraid of fatalism, are what replaced the neatly wrapped conclusions of Hollywood, fracturing the expectations of American cinemagoers with something that felt real and dangerous. It felt as though for the first time in a long time, there was something deeply resonant about American cinema, that it was finally able to echo the angst of what was in the air around them. The irony was that it took the United States to look outward in order to evolve their work, when in reality, that many of the filmmakers they were looking towards, particularly those of the French New Wave, gained their cinephilic status by studying the cinema of the US. Many of the European masters spoke and had writings on the masters that emerged from the Hollywood system, regularly referencing Wells, Hitchcock, and Hawks, and at a time when being part of the studio system earned some dismissals from their contemporaries, it was in fact the filmmakers of Europe that developed their fundamental understanding of film and the notion of the filmmaker as an auteur thanks to the Hollywood system. The irony of it all was that the culture, which was and always has downplayed the importance and impact of American cinema, was America itself. And so, after a complete 180, which almost turned into a 360, Seconds was one of the many seeds planted, which was proof that mainstream cinema could be a mirror to whatever existence may be defined as. By 1967, that original Hollywood dream was ending, and its death was all but solidified with Bonnie and Clyde. Murder became the focus, as violence became a new destructive force that forged a cinema that was alarmingly seductive.
What's it like?
Aren't you in prison?
No. Armed robbery.
Ain't like anything.
The carnage was portrayed in slow motion, and these violent criminals we exist alongside, we like them. A film that would have not long ago been thought to have been inconceivable was thrust forward as a major release and nominated for Best Picture. The film was on the cover of Time magazine. It shocked and enthralled audiences. And before we knew it, out came Easy Rider, a film whose rules were as carefree as the burnt-out highways they were pulled from. Low-budget avant-garde cinema with editing styles that had never been seen before, psychedelic drifts into new lenses of the world proved that film language had changed forever. And these new artistic vehicles could even be used to signify the arrival of a star like Jack Nicholson. By the time the 1970s had rolled around, American cinema had subtly transformed over such a short period of time. What was once an untouchable power could not suppress this urgency. And now, American cinema was undefinable. It was independent and cheaply made. It was also the home of the world's biggest stars. It was experimental and cutting edge. It was harkening back to a classical style of cinema. It was a film for the youth. It maintained the prestige of those that came before. Everything in this new American wave was what cinema had always been crying out to be. It was the complete vision. A film like The Graduate is so of the late 60s, dealing with the social unease of a young man cast into a society he feels no place in. And yet look at how these sequences are shot. It's not just experimental for the sake of it. It feels legitimately new, with a focus on handheld and what would be considered unconventional framing. Yet if there was ever a way in the medium of film to convey anxiety, this would be it. Our protagonist is constantly cut out of the frame. The edges are closed off, leaving no room to escape. This was new, and yet so familiar. It displayed the perfect evolution the art form needed. And before they knew it, New Hollywood was no longer an idea, as the 1960s left an array of films in its wake that completely flipped the script. Point Blank took Lee Marvin into a prototype for what the Terminator would become. Fracturing time and dreams within an action thriller. Medium cool blurred fiction and reality so seamlessly that it felt like a new way to explore the very idea of truth-telling through art. How is it that cinema can show us just who we are? And in a film like They Shoot Horses, Don't They? An ensemble cast was assembled to tell the frantic and desperate tale of the American dream. This was new storytelling, and it felt as though that barrier that had so long existed between the studio and the independent, between the artistry and the entertainment, had been demolished, and the artists that were to step out of its remnants would change the medium forever. The American New Wave became so ubiquitous that there has yet to be a period of film in which so much quality was dispersed onto the scene. And this is what's so fascinating about its impact. When we look toward other movements in cinema, we can see very clearly that there are a small collective of directors, like the French New Wave, or if we look at the Czech New Wave, we see films that are made through a certain lens. Often absurdist themes of the human shadow are the most prevalent. Or if we look at a movement like Dogma 95, the entire movement is aesthetic based and can be defined by the techniques that were implemented in the films. However, this precise definition has to be much broader when speaking about this era of American cinema, because what it excelled in beyond any of the other movements was its variety. Films like Wanda are a gritty existential look into the life of a wandering woman without purpose or even any feeling to the world around her.
I don't have anything. Never did have anything, never will have anything.
You're stupid.
I'm stupid.
The Panic in Needle Park features Al Pacino at the very beginning of his career and is about the fracturing relationship of two heroin addicts. These films are shot on handheld in the real-life streets that they want to represent. They're a far cry from the glitz and glamour of what we expected from Hollywood. Films of this kind are emblematic of a certain look of this era. Where Technicolor was meant to dazzle, the grit that came with 1970s American cinema was baked into the celluloid itself. The development of faster film stocks allowed for shooting in lower light settings. This gave the films that moody intensity where light bled into darkness. Grain began to be used as a texture of the film like it was part of the mise-en-scène. The artifice of the raw material was juxtaposed with the intimacy of many of the filmic techniques. The cameras became untethered and handheld, zoom lenses snapped things into focus. They employed an imperfection in the methodology because to them reality was imperfect, and the broken and often flawed characters began to look like they emerged from the very film stock that created them.
When I squeeze off a couple of shots at you, you take it, hit it, and hit it hard.
I want balls when you die. All right, let's roll them.
Yet this gritty reality was just one fraction of American cinema, because ingenuity within the form was all anyone wanted. These artists had been raised on Kurosawa and Hitchcock and Ford, and they were respecting those that came before them by using their methods in new and innovative ways. For instance, genre began to make a huge return during the New Wave, and there was no limit as to which genres would easily nestle within the movement. The Exorcist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are two of the milestones of American horror, yet they were more so milestones of American cinema. The Exorcist took the Hammer horror style of the 1950s and completely transgressed it into a religious, personal, and horrifying tale of faith and humanity. How could a major production have such an acute understanding of the terrifying? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre took that gritty look of the era and amplified it. They shot on 16mm rather than the traditional 35, and the film stock they used required much more light than normal, resulting in that highly contrasting look of the film we see today. And this is just one segment of the horror genre. All genres were represented. The Wild Bunch literally destroyed perceptions of the Great Old West by taking our once noble heroes and turning them into violent fanatics in an orgy of old world carnage. And then of course, there's Star Wars, which for all its pop culture dominance is still a staple of the American New Wave. Which brings us to the element of the movement, which, if we were to pick a defining aspect of, is perhaps the most well known, and that is the small collective of filmmakers that embodied the spirit of the time, the movie brats. Atop the pantheon of this new breed of energetic films and filmmakers sat cinephiles bred on old school craftsmanship and radical new forms of storytelling. These were Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Brian De Palma. Each of them brought a unique vision to cinema, whether it was transforming genre films into high art or bringing cinema into the vision of a blockbuster. The ambition between them was limitless, and there was a reason that they were the definitive face of the decade. They epitomized filmmaking by passion, pushing the technical limits of cinema to develop brand new tools, bringing their encyclopedic knowledge of the medium to their own visions, and employing the perfect hybrid of independent and studio mindsets. But amidst all of this, we should also try to find the specificity of what this era also brought and what it had to offer that other movements and eras didn't. And I think that we can keep it relatively simple. The new Hollywood movement may have been the biggest leap forward for acting that cinema had seen.
You shoot, Nicky! No, Nicky! Oh, you got... Oh, you're gonna die, you motherfucker!
The two cornerstones we can look at that instigated this movement date all the way back to Konstantin Stanislavski and Lee Strasberg. Lee Strasberg would become more known for his role as Hyman Roth in The Godfather Part 2. However, he spent most of his life as an acting coach. Some of his students included Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman, James Dean, Jane Fonda, and Paul Newman, to name a few. Strasberg encountered Stanislavski by chance many years prior and adopted his technique that focused on actors inhabiting the psychology. Strasberg's implementation of the technique can be viewed as the beginning of method acting in film. According to Strasberg, the actor must constantly respond to stimuli that are imaginary. Although he can do things in life quite easily, when he has to do the same thing on stage under fictitious conditions, he has difficulty, because he's not equipped as a human being merely to play act at imitating life. He must somehow believe. He must somehow be able to convince himself of the rightness of what he's doing in order to do things fully on the stage. Strasberg evokes psychological techniques in his teachings that would encourage his actors to think as his characters. And this revolution in acting was displayed in full force during the movement. Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Al Pacino in Dog Day Afternoon, the list goes on and on. The deep dive into psychological complexity also led to a naturalism. The whole thing seemed effortless and began to result in performances from everyone on screen where the boundary between reality and character was broken. There was an honesty and sincerity with how people performed as people. Just these filmmakers and actors and collaborators I've mentioned, existing in a single period alone, would have been enough to quantify a memorable movement for cinema. However, the thing about the American New Wave is that there's so much of it. When it comes to the study of cinema as an art form, there's a reason that so much of it is saturated within this era. Because the experimentations and breaking against conventions from the 1960s that were exemplified with the French New Wave were finally embraced by the heights of the cinematic pyramid. And so all of this transgression and experimentation had the budget and the scope to finally match it. We see such an explosion of ingenuity, because imagine a world wherein the big companies and studios actually trusted the creative vision of its artists, and the world is thus shaped through such visions. Of course, not every project was so lucky, but where do you even begin with what New Hollywood had to offer? I think of those ensemble casts that evoke that sense of urgency of the time. A filmmaker like Robert Altman gives us Nashville, an interwoven tapestry of what America is, and that same overlapping chaos is present in The Long Goodbye, in which dialogue is spoken over itself, characters interrupt, and the protagonist finds himself in a morally ambiguous world.
Keep it clean, Socrates.
Great, thanks a lot. So, listen, man, they don't have
Smaller, not
burglars
coming
and
back
thieves in
here.
here anymore, and rapists. You know what they got in here now?
And it's funny, because we speak of the old guard and respecting the traditions of the medium, and yet these very same techniques could be seen in Touch of Evil. Again, there has always been a tight thread between these innovators and the old masters. Polanski's Chinatown is a neo-noir re-envisioning that still uses all of the tropes of the traditional noir genre. Detective agencies with Venetian blinds, a story that's much larger than our protagonist could ever have envisioned. It harkened back to the days of Billy Wilder, but with an even keener and sharper critique of modern society. The French Connection gives us an obsessive detective film that's perhaps mostly remembered not for its stellar performances, but for the most dangerous and hectic car chase in the history of cinema. Meanwhile, other films built entirely around cars, such as Two Lane Blacktop, have a completely different approach. A meandering road movie whose protagonists have an almost indifference to the roaring engines of muscle cars that fill the soundscape. Meaninglessness becoming so pervasive that the film itself can't keep up with it and disintegrates into nothing. Angst pervaded throughout the decade, with Paul Schrader penning some of the grimmest glances into humanity gone wrong, with a forgotten gem like his Rolling Thunder about a Vietnam veteran on a crusade of vengeance. Similar acts of vengeance we would also see uncomfortably enacted in Deliverance.
There's no way we can change what happened to Bobby. We gotta do the right thing. Ed, we're gonna have to live with this for the rest of our lives. Right!
Peter Bogdanovich was another of the plethora of filmmakers who honoured Hollywood's golden past while helping to reshape its future. The Last Picture Show was his elegy for a dying America, shot in stark black and white. It drips with loneliness and nostalgia, yet rawly depicts a generational decay. Even What's Up Doc, his homage to screwball comedies, proved that classical Hollywood forms could be revived with a sharper, more anarchic edge.
Thank you, I don't drink. You're upside down, sir. I'm upside down.
You have George A. Romero creating the zombie movie, only to make interpersonal drama wherein the horror lies. Gordon Willis becomes the preeminent cinematographer, finding mixtures of intimate drama and grandiose spectacle throughout his work, and collaborates with another up-and-comer of the time in Woody Allen, who finds that in neurotic intellectual comedy, there too lies room for cinematic invention.
I heard what you were saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
Scarecrow displays the brilliant chemistry between Al Pacino and Gene Hackman and quietly wins the Palme d'Or, as does All That Jazz some years later, with Bob Fosse crafting a complete vision of music, film and dance into a spectacle the likes of which hadn't been seen before. Even in a film that puts the theatrical first, everything of this era prioritized doing something unique with cinema. Walter Murch completely re-envisions the importance of sound design in the conversation in a way that hasn't been as important in cinema since perhaps Fritz Lang's M, and it goes on and on and on. Filmmakers that had only one masterpiece within them, if they were around during this period, they had the means to get it made. Everywhere you look during this period, someone, somewhere, is making something great.
You stupid fuck-cocks! Get away, assholes!
The perspective of American cinema and Hollywood has never been in a position of overwhelming adulation. There have always been dissenters against all thing Americanized, and in many instances rightly so. However, to utterly dismiss the output of this incredibly innovative and creative point in history is a fool's errand. We should show appreciation that even amongst the breadth of cinematic creativity, the United States, historically, has been responsible for some of its greatest achievements. So then, what happened? Well, it was the same as what caused the initial fall of Hollywood's golden age. The ebbs and flows of the industry wait for no man. Granted, Jaws and Star Wars showed us just how successful a film could be. But when the studios began to lose their power to directors, and learnt that some of these filmmakers were not putting the profit first, schisms began to arise. The artists of the era had made the businessmen realise that there's a vast importance to this medium that they couldn't lose out on. Thinking they would save money by giving George Lucas royalties would not be a mistake they would make again. By 1982, the Twilight Zone movie resulted in the death of 3 people during its production, including 2 children, and even collaborator on the film Steven Spielberg began to see the detriment to unbridled creativity and calls for New Hollywood to end, as must all good things. But what was it that created the space for all this in the first place? It was an industry that grew stagnant, a business that grew so disinterested in its audience as its audience did it. And the fact of the matter is that this mode of being is not sustainable for anyone. All human beings are drawn towards greatness. And so, when we think that it's impossible to resurrect the spirit of rebellion and mould the world in a new and more incredible vision than the one we currently inhabit, just remember, we've done it before, and we can definitely do it again.